Welcome everyone to today's SEI Live. Very excited about this topic on professional engineering, structural engineering, and licensure in general. I have two amazing guests with me here today. Before we get to them, I just want to introduce myself briefly and just kind of talk a little bit more on the guest. My name is Luis Duque. I'm a licensed professional engineer. I passed my exam this year, so it's been a topic that I've been learning a lot about and just researching and something I've lived through this year. So it's really interesting to be part of this panel here today. I am a member of ASE, SEI, and some of the organizations that are helping other engineers, and it's just a pleasure to continue serving the profession in general. Before we start, I just want to say that if you have any questions, make sure you send them on the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and answer as many questions as we can. I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this topic, and we're here to help you. So we'll start with Andrea and Chan today. Just want to introduce yourselves. Let's start with Andrea.
Sure. Hi, I'm Andrea Reynolds. I'm pleased and happy to be here today. I'm a structural engineer. I work for Smith Group, which is a large architectural and engineering firm. I'm based out of Detroit, and I lead our structural engineering group and have for quite a few years. I'm involved with SEI, AEI, and NCSEA, and I'm actually on the NCSEA licensure committee, as well as part of the exam development with NCES.
Great. Chen, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Good morning. Chen Lau here from Seattle. I'm a practicing structural engineer with Brown & Caldwell. We are a water engineering company with about 1,600 people around the country, about 40, 50 offices. My primary work right now is on wastewater treatment facilities. And before that, I joined them 10 years ago. So before that, I did a lot of commercial stuff, buildings and stadiums. And so I've been around the block, per se, a little bit with my career, doing different things, trying to get new challenges through my stage of my career. So currently, like I said, I'm residing in Seattle, and I've been involved with NCSEA, NCES, SEI, and currently I'm the chair of the SEI SE Licensure Committee. That's probably the reason why I'm involved here. Also, a part of that, I'm an alternate delegate to Structural Engineering Licensure Coalition. You probably hear that term through this chat today, SELC, which comprises of NCSEA, SEI, and CASE. CASE is part of ACEC, that the three entity right now used to have SECB also, but SEBC will be discontinuing the certification program coming next year. So we'll be remaining three organizations composing the SELC moving forward with structural licensure.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the two of you sound like the perfect guests for the SEI Live. You have a lot of knowledge on the PE and the SE exams. It's something that I know a lot of, especially younger engineers that are looking to get into this topic and start preparing for the exams. I'm sure they're going to have a lot of questions, as well as just more senior engineers as their career progresses, changes in licensure requirements in different states and everything. So I'm just excited to start this conversation. And I'm just going to start asking the both of you, why is it important for engineers, especially younger engineers that are starting their careers, to get their professional license? We can start with either of you.
Yeah, Andrea, you want to go first, or you want me?
Sure, I can go first.
Okay.
One thing, I feel it's important for everybody. It's kind of a logical first step for a lot of engineers as you're progressing. Obviously, to stamp drawings and complete projects, you have to have a stamp and be licensed. But also, even if you're not the person stamping the drawings in your firm, a lot of times firm progression or career progression within your firm is dependent on licensure. And so it's definitely an important thing to do as quickly as you reasonably can.
Yes, as follow-up, it's more also a career path too. So basically, when you started out, you work under the direct supervision. If you look at a lot of state board regulation, EIT or from FE, engineer coming out from college who work under direct supervision of a professional engineers. So you want to move progressively forward with your career, with your experience. So naturally, with the step is to get licensure. And after you get your licensure, technically you will be able to work independently on your own and making your own decision on design aspect of the project and be a consultant to your client to make certain decisions and things like that. It's a lateral progression to take more on the responsibility, whether you end up stamping the drawing or not, but then you have that kind of validation by your licensure that you can work independently on your own.
Yeah, and I think that's super true. I mean, like I said, I passed the exam and got my license this year, and I obviously don't feel any different. And I think I just magically became a better engineer by just passing the exam. But just the procedure of studying for the exam, preparing for so many hours, I think that's really a great achievement for everyone that is looking to get licensed. Something that is kind of in the horizon, obviously, as a structural engineer, is the structural engineer license, maybe a few years down the road. I just want to hear from you, Chen, what's the difference between the PE license, the SE license, and what are some of the things to keep in mind when trying to get these two licenses?
Well, I mean, it probably a big long story, but I might try to make it short. In general, most state board have this what we call generic PE licensure, means that you take an exam in your own discipline from NCES, and once you license, then you get a PE. Then you should practice within your own competency. Say you're practicing structural engineering. Once you get a PE. Structural engineering licensure is more of the requirement for more of a specialized. When we look at currently, the model is that certain significant structure, certain threshold structure that are complex, that require more specialty, that require you to learn more. Say, for example, high wind, high seismic area requirement for some of the state board, then you can venture into the 16 hours structural engineering licensure examination for that. So that's more of a difference between a little bit. I hate to use the word specialized, but some people don't like that. But it's really a special branch of civil engineering, just like the other hydraulic and other things that under civil engineering, we are one branch there. So we want to home in on that requirement, especially in some state, which requiring, like a significant structure, essential facility, threshold facility that require a structural licensure. That's what the structural exam is all about, to look at the competency of an individual in doing some of those type of structure.
Right. Yeah. I know there's a lot of benefits on just having the license as structural engineer. And obviously there's many things that come from it that are changing and evolving very rapidly in the profession. Do you have anything to add, Andrea, to this question?
I was just going to say that in some states, though, to practice structural engineering, it's actually required to take the SE exam. So Illinois, for example, they don't have a PE for a civil engineer practicing structural engineering. So of course, not all states are created equal in how they assign licensure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the follow-up question, and I had this question when I was kind of preparing for the PE exam, is what's the normal progression? Do you have to get your PE license before you can take the SE exam? Are they related to each other, or how do you go about getting those two licenses?
Andre, you want to take that one?
I can start it. I probably need some help because this is not an easy question to answer.
Yes,
yes. I can tell you what path I took. In a lot of cases, this is probably the path I would recommend. It's not necessarily, or a similar path is what I would recommend. It's not necessarily going to be the same for every state, especially when you have states like Illinois. But I started out, I'm in Michigan. started my career in Michigan, we do not have a SE license, and we do not have a roster designation for structural engineering for the PE either. And so I took the civil structural exam, not really thinking, I was kind of young and dumb at the time and not really thinking beyond, what's the next step. But as I got further along into my career, I realized that, I really want to get my SE. We do a lot of work in Illinois. It would be really beneficial if I ever want to move to a different part of the country. That's kind of a next step. So I took that. At the time, it was the SE1, SE2, which is essentially equivalent to the 16-hour exam. As my career progressed and I started leading our structural engineering group, getting licensed on the West Coast was more important, or was becoming more important to me personally, as well as to my company. And so I then, because we didn't have the 16-hour at the time, I took the Washington SE3 exam, which actually Chun is the one that signed my license, believe it or not. But with those kind of that exam process, I was able to get, and still able to get, licensed in almost every state. California has a surveying and seismic exam that they require. I took that somewhere along the way, just to get the PE. But as you can see, it's really convoluted. What I think works for many of the states is if you take the civil structural and then take the 16-hour. Fortunately, people don't have to take yet a Washington or California state specific exam.
Okay.
Anything I missed there, John?
No. It's a good progression. So I have a similar, similar path for me, because I didn't really start from Seattle, Washington. I started back in Boston, when I practiced for about 5 years, and I got my first licensure. When you hear a lot of times when we talk about the first licensure, like your first PE license, your typical where you practice as your home state. So I was practicing in Massachusetts, and so I took the PE exam because I was practicing structural. Back then, they are like Andre said, there's a PE SE roster designation in Massachusetts. They don't call it structural SE, but they have a roster designation. So I took the 8 hours, the old 8 hours SE1 exam, which is an essay, a constructed response. So not the multiple choice one that most people have been seeing nowadays. So I'm that like ancient in that sense. So I took that and become licensed PE in structural roster in Massachusetts. So I said, oh, I'm set. I'm a structural engineer. So when my wife and I decided to move to Seattle, move to the Pacific Northwest, I literally applied to state of Washington for my PE licensure. And I said, well, I have a structural, technically structural from Massachusetts. Get me my structural license. And they looked at me and said, no, you only qualify for PE civil, but you can practice structural up to a certain type of structure. But you have to take our structural exam. That was a 16 hours exam. That's a post PE. So Andre probably, it's a post PE requirement at Washington. You got to have the first PE, which require about 4 years experience, and then you practice 2 more years before you can sit for the 16-hour structural exam, whether it will be the old one or the current one or a combination of it. That's how Washington work. So it's a post PE, so I had to practice a little bit more before they let me sit for an exam. It took me another year, so I had to sit for the 16-hour exam. So that's one of those post PE requirements that the most of the West Coast state, like Washington, Oregon, and California. And when I was, like Andre said, I'm an emeritus member for the Board of Washington. So we always call it the rim of fire along the coast, right? It's all the high seismic. This rim of fire states that they really concentrate on the seismic requirement of the examination. So given that local environment, that their geographic that they deal with, you can understand the importance of having that background and that knowledge to practice in the coast, West Coast. So that's the post PE requirement there. So there's a lot of things because of the way that each state board have its own state sovereignty, and they set the bar. So that's the thing that NCEES been around for. NCEES been around for over 100 years. The reason why NCEES was formed is to get all the state board together so that we have a more mobility. But we're still talking about this because each state will not necessarily easily give up, their state right to say, okay, I will follow whomever. So each state still have their own requirement that they set. So each one of you will have to look at your state requirement and say, what's required of me to get my first licensure? Then from that point on, I would recommend that if you look at like, hey, eventually I want to be moving to the West Coast. So then you prepare on what's requirement over there. So you can, once you prepare your first licensure, what's next for you? So it's a career path for, when I did that migration from Boston to Seattle, I never thought about that. So that took me by surprise. I have to do that. And when the company asked me to get a license in California, to my surprise, they have a civil seismic and surveying requirement on the PE civil before they even give me an SE. So I have my SE already. I took the 16-hour exam, but they come back to me, California come back to me and say, hey, you're missing the 4 hours exam. So I have to take another 4-hour exam down there. So the recommendation, the suggestion is looking at what you want to do as far as your career path, where you want to be like moving to and things like that. When you prepare for that licensure requirement, just look at each state and see, did I satisfy all those, and be prepared. Don't get caught in that sense. So
yeah, that's quite the journey of just licensure and taking exams and moving from state to state. That I know it's complicated for engineers with all the limitations and everything. Are there any states that can let you sit on the SE exam before you take the PE? I know Illinois, I mean, it's obviously a requirement. Are there any states that let you sit for the SE before you take the PE that you're aware of?
I don't know the answer to that personally. I do know that a lot of the states are working on what's called decoupling in the licensure world, where the exam, the timing of the exam is not related to when you get your license, and you can take the exam, right out of college almost. Yep. I don't know if Illinois allows you. They might be the one that I could think of if they do allow it, but honestly, I don't know where all the states are in that process.
So to answer your questions, I think the question is, does the state allow you to take the 16 hours without taking the PE right first, right? So a lot of state, a lot of state right now allowing it to be a first PE exam. So I believe from memory, 41 jurisdiction allow this being taken as a 16-hour exam. But then out of the 41, the post PE state, like the Rim of Fire I mentioned, and a couple other, maybe about 6 of them will require you to have a first PE first. Those information are very readily available on NCEES website. If you look at them and you go to nces.org, you can do that. So that's the complication now when it comes to when you take that 16 hours as your first PE, then when you come to Washington and then you never had the first 8 hours PE, that become a little bit tricky situation for a lot of state board which require post PE requirement. So naturally, like I said, if you are planning on moving to certain area, just look at what the route what's the path that you could take to best position yourself to be able to move there and be licensed there without having this sometimes a sequencing issue. Some state will have. It's had nothing to do with the state board. It's the way that the legislature written in the law that you shall do this, that, and that, and then nothing else that the board can do sometimes. So if they feel like you have the right experience, the right examination, but just because the legislature say you shall do step 1 first before you step 2, even the FE waivers, like some state will give you, if you never have a fundamental exam, some state will waive it, but some state won't. So if you never had an FE, you never took an FE, in certain jurisdiction, you may not even be able to license PE because you never had a FE exam. So it's one of those things that I highly recommend everybody to look at the state requirement. Again, just never one size fit all in licensure, unfortunately. So yeah, well, Andrea, you wanna, yeah.
There was one thing I was gonna add, your point about moving, if you think you might move to the, the West Coast at some point in your future, definitely look into that. But also, kind of think about what your plan for your future career is. I've lived in Michigan, but I work all around the country. And so I still have to deal with all these licensing issues as we go after work in other states to make sure that I can get licensed and have that stamp ready when we're ready to issue the project. So we've obviously become a lot more mobile in this virtual world. So
yeah, those are great points. Let's jump on. There's been a few questions here on the chat, so let's start answering some of those. Danny asks, can you talk more about what fields typically encourage the structural engineer license? I know for me, that's not really a requirement for what I do, and I know certain states is a requirement regardless of the work. What are some specific fields that require the structural engineering license?
Generally, it's probably more on the building design in most states. So if you're designing buildings, you're probably more affected by it. Obviously, with the exception of Washington and Illinois, I know for sure if you're designing bridges, then you need your SE. But it's also thinking about those threshold structures. Are you going to a company on the building design side that might be designing hospitals or emergency response facilities, because that's where those threshold structures are really going to hit you with that license requirement.
Yeah. And typically, my understanding, there's a paper by my colleague, Carl Josephson from state of California. He's also a Matrix member there. He put out a couple of articles on the structural magazine about significant structure. So if you look at that, and basically more like if on a building code term side, terminology wise, risk category 3 and 4, and that's mostly where they are going to require calling this threshold or significant structure that some state will require that it need to be a structural licensure. And then I find out that also some local jurisdiction can do that because the state mandate a minimum. And I was interesting to look at Idaho at one time, and Idaho doesn't really have the significant structure, but the deputy director from the Idaho board told me that the couple local jurisdiction by the mountain where they have heavy slow low. And they said, well, we better have structural engineer who know what they're doing to design this type of structure. So they put in the ordinance that requires structural licensure, because Idaho does have structural licensure license, even though they don't have that significant structure, what we call a partial practice act. So really, just in general, the risk category 3 and 4 are mostly the type of structure that got written in as like template for what a significant structure are, or so that kind of a parameter for that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I've never heard that requirement in terms of like the license that you need for like the county requirements. I work in the Front Range in Colorado, and I worked in residential construction for a couple of years. And one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out what kind of loads we need to design for, because each county, each city had like its own requirements for the load, even if they were a couple miles away, which was kind of interesting and just something that I had never really deal with in the past. So that's kind of interesting that there is similar requirements, especially with the licensure. What are your thoughts on the PE exam going computer-based testing next year?
Because I'm going to chair.
Yeah.
let's
So
get
that's
the NCES answer.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a loaded question. I mean, the exam is going to be computer based. It's currently slated for 2024. We haven't necessarily started writing the computer based exam yet. We anticipate starting that that process next year, although we've been doing a lot of planning for it naturally. You know, the big thing that we're concerned about is making sure that the people that are kind of in mid process of going through the licensing exam don't have to go back and retake anything. So it's going to have a very similar format. The spec is going to be very similar to what you see posted now for the written portion of the exam. The morning portions are still going to be multiple choice. The afternoon portions are going to be more of a constructed response format, maybe obviously not identical to what those are. That's where you're going to see the biggest change, but it's still going to be split between vertical and lateral components so that, you know, the people that have already taken the vertical component will not have to retake that component. They will only have to worry about taking the lateral component.
That's quite interesting. Do you have any thoughts, Chen?
Well, like there's always some transition issue. So, I mean, every time you change the format, you know, it's always like the learning curve for people. So when we went from the state specific to the national exam, that's always people kind of, should we wait? Should we wait? And should we do this one and that one? So you really have to look at where you are at the process. And always when the transition happens, there's always some learning curve, no matter what you do. So whether you try to beat the transition and get it done before then, or you wait after that, it's a tough decision. So when you get to that point and we are close to that point, do we finish up the paper and pencil one that grade maybe grading by graders versus like a computer telling yes and no, A, B, C, D, you know? So that type of transition, just individually, you have to kind of look at where you are at and try to get into the process. It's a tough decision. It's a tough decision, wait or not wait. You know, when you are right at that threshold there. So I can see that.
Yeah. I know that's a question that I've gotten a lot, especially with the PE civil going CBT next year. There's a lot of people trying to figure out what. Obviously, it's too late at this recording, but it's a big question because there's definitely a different set of challenges with the computer-based versus the paper and pencil one. With the SE going CBT kind of in the near future, what are some of those challenges that you can anticipate people need to prepare for? I know for the PE one, you can really bring all your materials. You just have like a document that basically encapsulates everything you should know about the topics. What are some of those challenges that you foresee coming up for the SE exam?
I think a lot of those challenges are going to be pretty similar. In the short term, you know, you mentioning civil going to CBT next year is a good point to bring up because with them doing that, they actually weren't not supposed to switch over till 2023, and they accelerated that up a year, which leaves us being the only pencil and paper exam left. And so just trying to schedule out those exam days in April and October a little bit more challenging, and obviously more limiting to our future structural engineers taking the exam. Obviously, once we're computer based, it'll be more accessible again. But on the actual candidate side, taking the exam, you're going to have a similar challenge in the data or the codes and references that you're using. You will get codes and references, the codes and standards that we're testing on in the exam. And you will get that reference manual similar to what the other exams are doing. But obviously, you're not going to have your own personal study materials with your tabs in it and your notes in it. So you can purchase a copy or will be able to purchase a copy of the reference manual prior to the exam to use that to prepare. But of course, you're going to get a clean copy on the computer. That.
Do you have any thoughts, Chen?
Yeah, I echo what Andrea is saying. Basically, it's again, once you change the format, how you prepare for it. Like you mentioned, when I took the 16-hour exam, that was a Western State exam, the old one. So people carrying the whole bookcases in, right? I mean, I call those crutches, right? You rely on the crutches, and you're familiar with your own reference book, right? You know where the beam loading diagram, you have all those tab, especially material that you don't practice a lot. Like for me, I don't do a lot of wood and masonry. So I rely on my own labeling of section to help me through the exam. So it's a preparation things, what the council going to provide based on CPT, on like what Andrea is saying, the reference book. You need to be familiar with what's there to be able to find it when you get there. So it's probably a little bit transitional on how you prepare for the exam and how you stay on top of it. And for me, I'm the paper and pencil person, right? I like to flip the paper, and now you're going in front of a big computer monitor screen. Even right now, if I look at review drawing on PDF on Bluebeam, I kind of like, oh, whether I scroll on this side, that side. I like to flip, right? So I'm old school, but most people nowadays with the examinee probably be used to working in front of a monitor. So that type of transition probably make a little bit difference at first, but you just need to, again, as an exam preparation things that you need to get used to and be able to find the thing at the reference that you need for certain material, especially certain material that you're not familiar with.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge. I know for the P exam, when I took it back in April, I basically had like a summary that I just created myself, like a document where I basically summarized everything. And it was just nice to have that because I knew exactly where everything was. I knew I had certain tables that were going to be really useful. Obviously, the steel manual was a lifesaver for like calculating beam moments and shear that are tables really easy, accessible. But I imagine the computer-based one is going to have a functionality to like search for terms, something like that, like the FE did when I took it a few years ago. And I think that's also going to be beneficial for, in the case of the PE Civil, for like the morning session when I honestly study maybe a couple of weeks for that, because there's a lot of terminology, a lot of things that I don't really do every day. I just needed to be aware of where they were in the term. So I just flip a tab, find the concept that I was looking for, and then kind of move on to the next question. I'm sure you'll be able to search that document and just type something and look for it. It's going to be a different challenge, but I think that's going to be beneficial for certain topics. And again, some people are going to hate it. Some people are going to love it. But I think that's kind of where the profession is moving, just a more computer-based profession. I know with COVID and everything, there's a lot of challenges that came with that. But we at the office kind of transition a lot to do a lot of Bluebeam, a lot of
Andre, did we lose
I think we might have.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was just me.
Well, one thing I was going to mention while we're waiting for him to get connected again too is that NCES does have some links on their website, and I think they actually have a YouTube channel that has some maybe not, well, I think some of them are tutorials, but also some walkthroughs so you can see what the computer-based exam looks like. And like I mentioned, the structural exam will look very similar on the multiple choice side to what all the other exams look like. The constructed response will be the one that, or the afternoon portion is the part that's going to be a little bit different than everyone else.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, basically, there's probably technically there's no difference. You're filling the bubbles versus like at a computer putting in bullet A, B, C, D. So the process of filling the bubble is the same, but then like you say earlier, because it's computer based, you don't have your whole references with you. So that the biggest transition will be try to figure out how you can work with whatever the supply reference be familiar with it, and be able to use it to provide the work that you need to do to get the answers, to answer the question. So.
I was just looking to see in the YouTube chat if there were any other questions that came in. It looks like one that I actually know the answer to. I had said I didn't know anything about the decoupling with the states, but in Michigan, in my home state, I do know that you can take the PE exam right after the FE. I don't know if you have to have a degree to do that. But I do know that you can take the exam right after and not, it's not coupled with when you actually get your license.
That's correct. Because I think a lot of states right now, when they call the decoupling, in a sense that you go straight to NCEES to apply for the examination. Once you pass the exam, and some of the state will do this, and then you gain enough experience, then you come back to the state and apply for the licensure. So in a sense, the state does not approve you to sit for the exam anymore. Some of the state, not all of the state. So it's different requirements. Again, it's like some state do it, like again, still keep the approval process as part of, like approving you to sit for the exam as part of the process. Some state will only require you to come back after you finish the exam, pass the exam, and gain the experience, and then apply for licensure. So again, it's still a different model that some states are doing differently with this decoupling moving forward. So it's how the state administer the process. And again, unfortunately, each state still has to set their own bar, and you have to deal with state by state and really go through that. And again, NCEES does have a good website to go to and look through those requirements from each state board, and you can go from there as well. So, yeah, this is trying to get that decoupling a little bit challenging for it. So.
Chung, could you tell us a little bit about the Structural Engineering Licensing Coalition?
Well, the SELC is still working. SELC is really a collection of 3 organizations. So the only organization right now does not have their own licensure committee is CASE, because it's a company firm-based organization. So NCSEA and SCI are membership-based. So we do have 2 licensure committees that are working within our membership. And hopefully one of the reasons why we have a SELC is so that we can coordinate our efforts together and move forward the licensure. And we've been trying to do that for the last few years. Hopefully we're getting better at it. But the vision and mission is that we will try to get SE licensure in all jurisdictions in the country. And currently, I think the idea is that they are moving forward with a post-PE requirement. So they're going to be requiring 16-hour exam for the SE licensure. So it's a post-PE. So technically, you will have to have 8 plus 16 examinations for it. And the standard 4 years of minimum experience. So we didn't touch on a little bit on the model, the licensure model of 3E that NCEES has been working with a lot of state boards. So when you heard, you will hear a lot of times about the three-legged stools, the education, experience, examination are the 3E requirement for licensure. Education typically require ABAC, accredited degree, in most jurisdictions. And some jurisdictions, if you don't have an ABAC degree, they will not license you. So you have to look into that a little bit. And ABAC engineering degree, sometimes even, like if you do yeah, go ahead.
There is a process to have your education reviewed, though, in a lot of those states, right? They may not accept it, but...
Yeah, Yeah, you can, and depends on your experience. So some states have that within the administrative code that give them a little bit more authority. So they can look at and say overall like 3E, right? If somebody have 20 some years experience in practicing and no problem with their practice, clean record. So why are they sticking with the education part that they when he or she did their degree, it was not ABET accredited. So it really depends on the combination sometimes. But what I'm trying to say, the basic requirement is the education is ABET accredited. The experience need to be under a direct supervision of an engineer, that a professional engineer, and then the examination. So when we talk about decoupling, used to be like education come, experience, and then examination, right? You got 4 years and then examination. The decoupling means that they take this examination out from the last leg to somewhere in between the first and second. But you have to have, hopefully you have to have a degree before you sit for the exam. Otherwise, you are much smarter than a lot of us without finishing college and be able to pass the PE exam. So that's what the 3E was all about. So Louis, we try to touch base on a little bit of the licensure structure a little bit while you are having technical difficulty to do that, and about the decoupling. So.
Yeah, that's great. Something that I was wondering too is, what's the process for like international engineers that want to come to the United States and want to get licensed?
So
yeah,
assuming that they have not had education in the United States, or
correct.
So that's where, similar process where you have to have your education verified. With some of the more, I'm going to say like well-known or maybe more popular universities from other countries, they might have already been reviewed by some of the states and have agreements, but you'd have to have that. I think the biggest part is getting that education reviewed first.
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. I mean, I'm from Colombia. I got my education here in the US, but that's something that I do get asked quite a bit. Like people that want to practice engineering already have the degrees from another country. They want to come to US. Like, what's that process like of getting the professional license? And I'm always like, I'm not sure. Just contact the state board because they're probably gonna know more than I do, and that's the best answer I can give them.
Yeah, like Andre say, so what technical, what we call is foreign degree evaluation. So you will have to submit your degree information to the board. And typically right now, my understanding, if I remember correctly, only NCEES is doing the foreign degree evaluation. So the state board will send your information, your academic information to NCEES. I believe at one time there's one other entity, but I'm not sure at this point whether they still exist. So they evaluate you and then say you comply, you technically meet the ABET requirement and send it back to the state board. And if you have some deficiency, then they will tell the state board what is deficient. And what I've seen so far for a lot of foreign country, humanity is the deficiency. You probably, I mean, we foreign students, we always like concentrate on the technical side. We say, why am I bothering psychology? Why am I bothering with English literature? So the ABET requirement have the humanity part there that a lot of foreign degree most likely be lacking, that you don't have enough humanity hours in it. That kind of, then the state board have to decide that it's important. Even though it's part of the ABET accredited program requirement. So some state board will say, oh, okay, fine. But some state board may stick with it and say, sorry, you don't meet that requirement.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's move more into what happens after you pass the PE or the SE exam. There's a great question from Armand that says, that what if he takes the PE exam in Michigan? Can I use that in another state, or should I take the exam again for another state? And I think that goes into reciprocity and depending on which state they are trying to get licensed in. Do you guys want to talk about that and maybe some of the special cases like California, maybe other states that have like additional exams? and additional requirements?
Sure. So if you've taken the PE, like the civil structural in Michigan, and you're going to get licensed in another state that doesn't have an SE requirement, then you don't have to retake that civil PE exam. There's no reason that you retake the exam. I mean, even from SE state to SE state, you don't have to take the exam a second time, generally speaking. If Armin has taken and passed the exam in Michigan and chooses to go to California to get his PE, he would then have to take a surveying and seismic exams to get the PE there. If you're going to a state that has an SC requirement, then you might have to take the 16-hour structural exam.
Yeah, that's kind of what's been my understanding. And again, it's confusing. I think the NCS is trying to centralize everything with the NCS record. I had to do that here in Colorado, and it was super easy, super simple. And I'm sure it's going to make that transition to maybe another to get a license in another state. Obviously, considering it's maybe California or some of these states that require the SE license, probably super easy.
Yeah, the council record helps a lot with that. There's also the model law structural engineer designation you can get with the council record, which that can further help with getting reciprocity in some of the states, at least speeding it along a little bit. Yeah.
Let's go to another question here in the chat from Laura. She asked, what is your opinion on continuing education for renewal? And will they ever be uniform across states?
You want to take this one, John?
Technically, if that brings up a good point. How often does one go back to look at the regulation or the statute in your state governing the practice of engineering? You probably glance through it when you try to apply for licensure, and you probably have to take a law and ethics exam in most states, like ethics exam, to talk about what you shall or shall not do. In a lot of states, it's embedded, even though they do not, I use the term mandatory check your contingency agreement, but in all jurisdictions, I would have to believe that it's embedded in there. As a professional engineer, you shall keep your competency, right? By using the term, you shall keep your competency. How do you keep your competency in your practice area? Shouldn't it be doing continuing education, learning more? Like, again, the building code every 3 years, unfortunately, change, right? So you have to keep up with the building code for building engineers. So in that sense, you're keeping up your continuing education in that sense, right? You go to code update seminar. So there are states that require a mandatory requirement, say, like Oregon, say you shall report, you shall do that. And some states will say voluntary, but if you get audited, then you have to prove that. So that's different levels of continuing education monitoring from different state board. So whether they do have that or not, and it also depends on the state, like how administrative wise they have the budget to. In state like ours, we probably are not one of the largest state. We probably have 27,000 licensees in Washington. California, you can imagine how many people they have. In order to audit all that people, how much the state have to spend, right, for staff. So it's also a budget requirement in some state that steer that discussion a little bit. But my thought is every engineer shall, continue education to maintain the competency, which is required by, I think, most jurisdiction by the statute. So whether you're being asked to produce it, to come up with something and to prove it, that's a different level. So my thought is, yes, every engineer, especially in the way that we practice, shall maintain our competency through continuing education. That's my personal position on continuing education. Now, whether we need to be told to show and to prove it, and the big brother's watching in a sense or not, it's up to the state, right? So I'm not going to go into that, whether state shall, do that or not. But I think personally, each individual as a professional engineer, you shall maintain your competency and again, practice within your competency level.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We're going to run out of time here. So if anyone listening to this wants to ask a question, make sure you get them in the chat. We'll try to answer a couple more here. I totally agree with you, Chan. Like, I think that's super important. Structural engineers, with something that is evolving so fast and new technology coming every single year, seems like on our profession, it's just super important to stay up to date to that. Code changes, just new research, new technologies. I did my research on like drone inspection using bridges 5 years ago, and it's great to see how far that has come in like inspection, analysis of structures and everything. So I think it's just super important to, even if the state doesn't require, like here in Colorado, I'm not really required to have PDHs, but that doesn't mean I don't attend the Structures Congress, I don't attend webinars. It's just useful to always stay up to date on all of those things. So one way to see if anyone has any questions, I had one that it's kind of different. And I think it's something that when I got asked this question, when I passed my exam, I didn't have a great answer for. Someone asked me, what if we can get someone to sign for your hours, your professional engineering hours when you're applying for the license, and what can they do?
This is probably not directly answering that specific question. But one of the challenges I had when I went to get my SE license in California is one of the requirements you have is you need to have 3 California SEs to sign off on your experience or as references, right? And so in that case, because of working on the exam committee in particular, there's a lot of West Coasters, there's a lot of people licensed in California. I was able to draw on more personal relationships I had with working within the engineering industry, but not necessarily working directly on work that were willing to sign for me. It gets a little bit more convoluted when it's talking about experience itself. Particularly, in some cases, as people age some of their first bosses and they're trying to get reciprocity and they need that experience from when they were younger vouched for, it gets a little bit harder as people retire and move on. Maybe Chun has some guidance on that since you worked on the Washington board for so long.
Yeah, well, we do have 2 levels. One is called employment, your experience verifier. The other one is references, right? That somebody can vouch for your professional expertise in that sense. So for verifier, sometimes if your supervisor is no longer there, then you can have somebody else within the company that can vouch that you were there. Technically, physically, you were there. So it's an experience verifier, right? The other one is the professional references that Andre is talking about. So the plug for me for the audience is that get involved with the SEI local chapters, any SEA, if a Structural Engine Association versus like SEI local chapter, get involved with technical committee, get involved with people that practice around you. Like Andre said, the best benefit is that they got to know you. And then if you need somebody to do that, then you have some avenue to approach them rather than, hey, who are you? I never met you. And you just first time show up, you ask for references and things like that. So I think depends on the state. So if the state require you to experience to verify that you have that 3 or 4 years experience, then technically anybody can do that. Again, it depends on how sticky the state want that to be, and then your professional references. So
yeah, that's great.
So always make sure that you leave a company in a good term, that you have people that were willing to vouch that you were there and to verify your experience.
Yeah,
Never burn your bridges. This is a small community. It's a really small community.
I'm working on bridges now. I had 3 companies that I had to fill out for my PE, and it was obviously great to stay in touch with them. The first one I worked for was right out of college 4 years ago, so that one was kind of a little harder to track the people if they were still working there and everything. But yeah, super important point. Just keep track of the people you worked on there and make sure you have them if you're thinking of taking the exam pretty soon. So we're kind of running out of time here. I just want to thank the 2 of you for coming to this SEI Live and sharing all the great things about the PE, SE, and licensure. This is definitely a topic that I get a lot of questions about, and it's just something that as young professionals, it's kind of really interesting to talk about. I just want to share a few next SEI events. The ETS Powering Past the Pandemic on November 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. The Structures Congress in 2022 on April 20 to 23rd. We'll hopefully be joining in person in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm really excited to hopefully see all the people in the chat and the 2 of you, hopefully. And again, thank you so much, Chun and Andrea, for coming to the SEI Live. And if you have any questions, probably leave them in the chat and we'll make sure we answer them at a future event. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for having
thank you.